Let's preview the 2023 Sunbelt Media Days next week in New Orleans with ESPN Plus host Matt Stewart. It's Locked On Sunbelt.
You are Locked On Sunbelt, your daily podcast on the Sunbelt Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another edition of Locked On Sunbelt, your team every day. I'm your host, David Schultz. We'll be in New Orleans for the Sunbelt Media Days on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. But let's preview them with one of the two hosts. Matt Stewart with ESPN Plus will be co-hosting Sunbelt Media Days with Rocky Boyman. Here is Matt Stewart. Welcome back to another edition of Locked On Sunbelt, your team every day. I'm your host, Dave Schultz. Thrilled to have our next guest going to be down in New Orleans for his 8th season of hosting Sunbelt Media Days. He is Matt Stewart. Matt, thanks so much for hopping on. Is there a big story that we should be looking for heading into Sunbelt Media Days?
I don't know that there's one big story. I think the overarching story for the Sunbelt is its continued rise to prominence among the group of five. And I think what we see with the American Conference taking a hit and basically going in and swiping some Conference USA teams, I think the Sun Belt moves closer and closer to becoming the preeminent group of five conference, if not already. I think, there's still some work to be done there, but I think so, top to bottom. I mean, you're looking at 14 teams, and I think probably, 10 of them are really competitive. You got 4 at the bottom that got some work to do right now. But I think that's the big story is Sunbelt just continues to get bigger and bigger in the group of five.
All right, so let's talk about the favorites. I think a lot of them are in the West. I think that the shift, the power has shifted from the Coastals and the Apps to the Troys and the South Alabamas. Who do you think are the favorites this year heading into 2023?
Well, I would agree with you on that. I mean, last year, both those teams finished 7-1. And as it turned out, the de facto Sunbelt championship game was actually a 10-6 victory for Troy at South Alabama.
That's right.
Because that won them the West. And then they won they won the conference championship. They beat a slumping Coastal Carolina team in the Sunbelt championship game. So in that regard, yeah, the power has shifted to the West, but it's top heavy. I think the Eastern Division is much more competitive top to bottom with 6 teams that are, liable to beat you, maybe 7, but certainly 6 that are liable to beat you on any given day. I don't know that that's necessarily the case in the West where it's more top heavy, but, South Alabama and Troy in the West, if I had my feet put to the fire right now, I'd probably give the nod to South Alabama based on what they have coming back, a little bit stronger defensively than Troy, but both of them are very similar in kind of their, the makeup, the DNA of their program and how they're built defense first and, offense. And I think the South offense might be a little bit better going into this season. And over in the East, I think James Madison's the best team. Unfortunately, they're not going to be able to play for the championship because the NCAA has already denied their appeal to become bowl eligible and championship eligible in season 2. So they're going to have to serve out the full, FBS transition penalty, if you will. And so I think Coastal then becomes, once again, even though they've got question marks and, everybody in the East has question marks, but I think maybe then Coastal. So maybe looking at a Coastal South Alabama championship game in 2023.
So that may not be good. You mentioned that James Madison, once again, can't represent the Sun Belt, can't represent the division in the Sun Belt Championship, can't go to a bowl game. They took out their frustration on Coastal Carolina last year. I know Grayson didn't play in that ball game, but they did not care one iota that they were quarterbackless or playing with a backup. And I mean, Kurt Signetti goes, "Are you guys raising a banner?" He's like, "We're the Eastern Division champions. We don't care what anybody else thinks."
Well, there's no doubt when I talked to Signetti last year for the first time at Sunbelt Football Media Days, you could tell there was a little surliness, a little edge to him in that, if you'll remember, shows you how much the experts know. James Madison was picked to finish last in the East. So,
right.
And yeah, arguably they were the best team in the East. And I think they're the best team in the East, coming back this year, even though they're having to replace Centoya at quarterback. Again, I base a lot of it on, what they're going to be able to do defensively. And I think they'll be good enough offensively to get the job done. So, yeah, James Madison is my favorite in the East. And if that's the case, it'll be kind of a weird situation because they won't be able to play for the title.
Talking to Matt Stewart, he's hosting along with Rocky Boyman the Sunbelt Media Days. Is that just going to be streamed? Is that where people can find it?
ESPN Plus, all of it will be on ESPN Plus. And of course, as in years past, it really is kind of we capture the whole thing. So, right. Part of the show is the coaches and the players coming in to talk to me and Rusty, and at the Sunbelt Studios, which are actually in the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, where the Sunbelt football headquarters are. And then the other half of the show is there at the Media Hotel, there at the Sheraton, where, reporters, TV, newspaper, radio reporters like you are there to ask them the really hard questions. So,
correct.
Yeah. So it's kind of a split thing. You get a double dose. For instance, you'll see Kane Womack, at the podium in the Sheraton. And then later on that same day, he'll be in the studio with us talking. So between us and all you reporters, we better be able to ask all the tough questions.
The tough questions are going to be Oppenheimer or Mission Impossible or both. That's the hard-hitting questions that I plan on asking. I certainly remember talking with Matt Stewart. Yeah, going to do both, as it turns out. I don't set the lines, and this is not necessarily a gambling show, although we do have some good sponsorship there. Someone knows something more than I do, and maybe more than you do. The over-under for South Alabama is 7.5 wins. I don't get it. Maybe they're taking Tulane and Oklahoma State as losses. Okay. And maybe Troy, but that's still 9. I'm missing something. Like you said, they're bringing almost everybody back. They do have to replace Jalen Tolbert. They do have to replace Darrell Luter Jr. And they got to replace the center, but they're moving the guard to center. And they have some, incoming transfers for the other positions. And they have some returning guys who, veteran guys that are back. Keith Gallman is going to be back.
And they got Keith Gallman, who was a great player for him in 2021, who didn't even play last year.
Right.
I mean, he'll be back too. They got the quarterback back. And they got the running back, LaDamian Webb, back, a 1,000-yard rusher. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, I honestly don't really look at non-conference schedules. I mean, they're great. Who's going to knock off? Is there going to be a Georgia Southern beating Nebraska this year? Is there going to be a situation where, Coastal, I think, Coastal's playing at UCLA this year, right? Is right?
But
yeah,
that's the thing.
Because are they going to go out there and get a win? Those kind of things are great, and the Sun Belt's kind of made it a practice now the last couple of years to knock off some Power Fives. App, back in September, we thought App might be playing in the college football playoff the way they started the season.
Right.
Nearly beat North Carolina in a shootout, and then they go out to College Station, and just hand it to Texas A&M. Then they come back with game day in Boone and have to get a Hail Mary to beat Troy, and then they collapse down the stretch. So, I mean, who knows? But I think in terms of conference records when I'm going into this. So, but those hot button games in September where they're playing Power Fives get a lot of attention.
Well, that's the thing. And you mentioned, how the Sun Belt has grown. A lot of it, that was that one day. What was it, like week 2 or week 3, all on the same day? Georgia Southern beats Nebraska. Marshall beats Notre Dame. And you mentioned App beat A&M. Well, South Alabama has Tulane, and that's not going to be easy. Then they go to OK State. If they end up 2-1 out of the first 3 ball games with Southeastern in the middle, the way the rankings work, they're going to work their way up if they continue to win in the Sun Belt, because all the rest of the top 25 is going to end up beating each other.
Yeah, so who knows what? I mean, obviously Tulane had a breakthrough season last year under a former Sun Belt coach, Willie Fritz, who was at Georgia Southern and won a conference championship his first year in the league at Georgia Southern in 2014. But who knows what they, obviously, what they did last year put them on the map, but the year before they were terrible. So, I mean, who knows? That's maybe a game that South Alabama is able to go in there. I certainly expect them to be competitive with Tulane. The Oklahoma State game, that's another matter. I mean, that's a tough place to play, but I wouldn't put it past them.
All right, let's take a time out. When we come back, we'll talk about G.J. Kinney and Texas State as he is turning over half his roster with like 37 transfers and 51 or 2 new players. We'll do that right after this. Let me tell you a little bit about eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, Dave Schultz back with more Locked On Sunbelt, your team every day. Let's continue to preview Sunbelt Media Days happening next week in New Orleans on Tuesday and Wednesday with ESPN Plus host Matt Stewart. Let's talk a little Texas State and G.J. Kinney. We're talking to Matt Stewart. He's hosting Sunbelt Media Days coming up Tuesday and Wednesday down in New Orleans. All right, what about some surprises? I am really intrigued by what ODU is doing, bringing in the high-powered offensive coordinator from Fordham and the backup quarterback from the Rams. And then you have G.J. Kinney at Texas State bringing in that kind of high-powered offense. He says they're going to light up the scoreboard. And by the way, he brought in 51 new players. So, I mean, he's really taking advantage of the portal.
Unfortunately for Texas State, this just seems to be a recurring theme. You get a new coach who turn the roster entirely over, and then 3 years later, they come back and do it again. Now, G.J. Kinney obviously has a great resume, led Incarnate Word to, a number 7 ranking in the country, an offense that produced 53 points per game, an offense that produced over 550 yards of offense per game, but you got to play defense. And when I start making predictions, I start looking at what you got coming back on defense. What do you got coming back on the offensive line? If I'm not mistaken, Texas State has nobody coming back on the offensive line either. So maybe they'll score a lot of points. They got an Arkansas transfer in there. They got TJ Finley from Auburn in there as, competing for the offense, for the quarterback job. So we'll see. But Texas A&M's got to figure out how to play defense, and they've got to settle into a pattern where, they're sticking by their guy. I'm not saying that Spavital shouldn't have been fired. I'm not saying that, but I mean, at some point you got to you got to settle in, buckle in for the long haul and build a program. Unfortunately, and it's not just them, it's everybody nowadays with the transfer portal. There is no thought of building a program, digging in and getting freshmen and stuff like that, because at the same time, you're going to be the victim of it too. You come in and you create players and build players and develop players, and then they leave. And we saw that with some Sunbelt players. Tez Johnson from Troy went to Oregon after he had a great season with the Trojans. So you got to and there's examples that are. You mentioned ODU, Blake Watson, their top running back, goes to Memphis. Ali Jennings, their top wide receiver, goes to Virginia Tech. So, yeah, they bring in the Fordham guy. They bring in the Fordham quarterback. But they also lost 2 big weapons on offense, too.
We're talking to Matt Stewart. He's hosting Sunbelt Media Days with Rocky Boyman Tuesday and Wednesday in New Orleans. You mentioned the coaches, and you got to let these guys build a little bit, but some of these coaches ruin it, right? Kane Womack all of a sudden sets a record in his second year with 10 wins, and then John Summerall screws it up for everybody, wins the Sunbelt Conference Championship in his first year ever as a head coach, and then Charles Huff is doing a great job at Marshall. Those guys screw up the curve for the rest of them.
Well, yes, true. I mean, you got to find a happy balance. I mean, There's no question. I'm not going to be idealistic and utopian here and say, well, let's go back to the old days where you recruit high school players and you develop them and redshirt them and do all that kind of stuff. Let's face it, schools don't give coaches that kind of leeway anymore. But you got to find a happy balance. But I don't fault Kenny for bringing 51 players in. He's trying to make a splash and get things done in a hurry. And in football, the transfer portal, in every one of the sports, as a matter of fact, the transfer portal now is the choice way of doing it. Let's see what we get in the transfer portal, and then we'll try to recruit around that, the high school kids. So, going back to the surprise question that you asked me, I never did really answer it before. A couple of teams that I think maybe have a chance to move up a little bit after moving up last year, Southern Miss and Georgia Southern. I think those are two teams. Let's see what they do. Will Hall in his second year as the head coach at Southern Miss, and his first in the Sun Belt Conference, went from a 3-9 to a 7-6. And they got a really good running back coming back, and Frank Gore Jr. got a question at quarterback there. But it looks like they've settled on a transfer for the starting job. And then same thing, at Georgia Southern with Bren coming in after Van Treese came in and lit things up and just turned the whole Georgia Southern program on its head, going from a option-oriented offense and around a ground game offense to a passing offense under Clay Helton. So they went from, I think, 3 wins to 6 as well in his first season. So let's see what they do. Again, it goes back to defensive questions for me. And out of those two teams I just mentioned, I think Southern Miss is probably in a little bit better spot defensively than Georgia Southern. But we'll wait and see what happens. Georgia Southern had to replace a lot of starters, but maybe that's a good thing. They weren't that great on defense to begin with anyway.
Talking to Matt Stewart, hosting the Sun Belt Media Days on Tuesday and Wednesday in New Orleans. All right, let's talk about a couple of coaches that are heading into year 3. ULM's Terry Bowden seemed to having it heading in the right direction, but Chandler Rogers used a transfer portal. He went to North Texas. Arkansas State's Butch Jones has had some really good recruiting classes, including the #1 recruiting class for 2023, but it's tough for, the freshmen to really contribute in a big way. But nonetheless, somewhere along the way, Arkansas State has to compete. I think they were like 2-10 and 3-9 in his 2 seasons. And again, ULM,
total,
ULM's got was headed in the right direction, but maybe the rug was pulled out from under them when Rogers left. What do you make of the Red Wolves and the Warhawks? Those two Warhawks may be the toughest job in Division I.
No, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. It is. I think it is. It's one of the toughest, if not the toughest. If there's one tougher, I'd like to know what it is. I mean, they deal with traditionally one of the smallest budgets in all of FBS football. Terry Bowden is, I think a perfect guy to bring into that position. He's had his career. He's not looking for, step up to another job. He's had his career. He's taken on this project. He's kind of an ambassador for this school. He's a guy that's not afraid to get out there and meet the Rotary clubs and the touchdown clubs and all the other clubs that you have to do to press the flesh and talk up the gospel of the Warhawk football program. So I think he's really good at that. I'd love to see them win. I would love, just simply because I love Terry Bowden. He's a great guy to hang out with and talk to. Comes from one of the first families of college football with his dad and his brothers and all that. So I would love to see them win, but you're right, it's a tough job. Arkansas State, I think just recently within the past week, I saw a story on, CBS Sports on their website. He made that list you don't want to make. He's one of the 7 coaches on the hottest seats in college football. So, he's 5-19. There's no question from a recruiting standpoint. They traditionally, since he's been there, they're winning the recruiting battles in the Sun Belt Conference as far as the recruiting rankings. But ultimately, that's got to, transfer into wins. That's got to translate into wins for you. And they got to improve their defense too, man. I think they're giving up 31 points a game last year, which is, not too bad in the Sun Belt Conference, but still it's not good enough to be a consistent winner.
Let's take one more time out. When we come back, we'll talk about ODU in the East. Ricky Rain trying to turn things around. They're coming in with a long losing streak. They, too, are bringing in and hoping for new offensive firepower. We'll do that next on Locked On Sunbelt. Once again, thank you so much for continuing to support Locked On Sunbelt. As of, I'd say, Friday, we're up to almost 350 subscribers. We are getting there. I surprisingly got a few over this past week, but that's great. And hopefully with the Sunbelt Media Days and getting to talk to the coaches, we will get more as we go along. Still, the goal is going to be 500 for Labor Day weekend before we kick off on that Saturday. And we do thank you so much. Remember, please subscribe on YouTube, but you can also subscribe wherever you get your audio podcasts, if that's what you prefer. Amazon, iHeart, Spotify, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts as well. If you do Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. It is a big help. But again, thank you so much for your support. We continue to grow by leaps and bounds. All right, let's get back to it. It is more Locked On Sunbelt, your team every day. We'll wrap up the Sunbelt Media Days preview with ESPN Plus host Matt Stewart talking about ODU and trying to bring in some new offensive firepower. All right, a couple more questions for Matt Stewart, co-hosting the Sunbelt Media Days with Rocky Boyman in New Orleans Tuesday and Wednesday. All right, so we mentioned G.J. Kinney as the new coach with Texas State. We got a new offensive coordinator in Fordham, from Fordham at ODU. What about the new coach at Coastal Carolina? You mentioned the offensive change at Georgia Southern. They're going to change they're going to be more pro-style offense with Tim Beck and Grayson McCall going into the portal and coming back. It's going to be really interesting to see how you can top what the three-time Sunbelt Player of the Year has done over the last 3 seasons.
Well, he's the difference maker. There's no doubt about it. The Coastal defense has to get a lot better, but I think we're pretty confident that their offense is going to be there, that they're going to be okay on offense with Beck, who, at the age of 57 is a first-time head coach. It's pretty amazing. They kind of bucked the trend there. That some of the programs, to be honest with you, it's not that unusual in the Sun Belt to go out and get an experienced guy. The thing that makes Beck a little bit different is he's not been a head coach. He's been an offensive coordinator for 12 years. He's worked with some of the best in college football and in pro football. He's worked with some of the best. So it'll be interesting to see, what it's like for him. I don't want to call it an advanced age. I hope it's not an advanced age, but it's older than most head coaches who get their first time shots. Right. So, that's going to be interesting to see. I think they're going to be right there in the mix for the Coastal, or in the East Division for Coastal. It's going to be a matter of, can their defense get better, I think, because offensively they got all the weapons. And even though, it's not Chadwell's offense anymore, it is going to be Beck's offense coming from NC State. So we'll see how that goes. But, his resume suggests that they should be fine offensively. It's what happens with this team defensively ultimately. But again, I've already told you, I'm predicting them, if not by default, they're going to end up playing in the conference championship game again. And if they beat James Madison, and they got throttled by 40 points last year, James Madison had a little bit of vinegar in them and beat them bad. If they're able to take it out on them this year, then they'll win it outright, because I think that's the game right there, the James Madison and Coastal game, if you're looking to single out one game in the East. And that said, let's don't bury App State.
Nope.
So quickly.
That's not what I thought you were going to say. All right, because I'm going to ask you about Marshall, because you like defense.
Yeah, and Marshall.
I think Marshall's been winning with defense, but they need to score a few more points more consistently.
There's no question. So those two teams that I just mentioned, I mentioned, Marshall and App State, not to be forgotten in the East. Don't want to, have a coronation for Coastal or James Madison just yet, because I think either one of those teams is also capable of stepping up and winning the East. I think it's more wide open than the West is. But App, uncharacteristic, 6 wins, didn't get to a bowl game because they had 2 FCS wins. I think it was their first losing season since 2017, or maybe even further back than that. Actually, their first losing season, I think, or non-winning season, I should say, since they joined the Sun Belt in their first year, I think it was, or maybe not even. I'm getting confused. It's been that long. App's been good, and they got to replace Chase Bryce at quarterback. They got a transfer coming in, doesn't everybody? But they should be great at running the ball like they always are. They got Nate Noel coming back. He rushed for 1,100 yards 2 years ago. Averages 7 yards per carry in his career. They should be okay. Defensively, they got Scott Sloan back, a guy who was in the program, was most recently DC at Georgia Southern before the coaching change there. They brought him back to be the DC. It'll be interesting to see what he does with that, they've got some holes there on the defensive side that they got to get better at. But I wouldn't count out App State. They collapsed down the stretch last year, losing 3 out of 4. Wouldn't count them out. Wouldn't count out Marshall. Cam Fletcher at quarterback. You're right. They ended up winning their last 5 games last year after a 4-4 start, and they averaged only 23 points per game while winning 5 in a row. That's almost unheard of in college football anymore. Their defense was that good. So I think they bring back 6 starters on the defensive side of the ball. So they'll have some they got some room to get better there too.
And they have a kid named Pennington waiting in the wings at Marshall. So that, that means a lot to Thundering Herd fans. All right, to wrap it up, we haven't talked about where I am in Lafayette. The Louisiana Raging Cajuns kind of starts, and I don't know about ends, but it's going to start with the quarterback because we have quite the battle. Who is healthy? And, do you go with a young kid or do you go with the experience?
Well, I think ultimately, after going 6-7 last year and 4 one-score losses, the coach deep inside of you might say, okay, well, let's plan for the future. But the reality inside of the coach is, man, maybe we got to go with the guy that's most experienced. So what do you feel, since that's your backyard? What do you feel is going to happen there? But my guess is ultimately you go with the guy with the most experience, because there's just not a whole lot of room to develop and grow once the season starts.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. Maybe Ben Woldridge is recuperating a little bit quicker than
the ACL
anticipated.
at the end of the season.
If that's the case, then you probably go with him. Otherwise, I might start with Zion Chris. I might take it on the chin for a month, but then I might be off and running for the next year and a half. That's the only thing.
Yeah, so that's the other team we haven't mentioned is the Raging Cajuns, who I think lost 9 of 11 starters on defense, and that includes 2 guys that bolted after spring practice.
Yeah.
So again, with me, that's always my go-to is where are you defensively? So they're a team that won 4 Western Division titles in a row in the 2021 Sun Belt Championship before Billy Napier got the call to go to Florida. DeSormo comes in and they go 6-7 last year. So I'm guessing I don't have to tell you it's your backyard. There's probably heat on him already because of that. So.
A little bit, but there's also understanding that, there was a turnover, few more players left than was first anticipated or was said to be the case. He's Matt Stewart. He's hosting Sunbelt Media Days with Rocky Boyman Tuesday and Wednesday down in New Orleans. Looking forward to breaking beignets with you, Matt. Thank you so much for hopping on Locked On Sunbelt. Really appreciate your time.
I'll take you up on that.